Hey everyone. So, been quite a while since I recorded one of these, and we are shifting gears quite a bit. We've been spending our time in Europe and looking at ancient civilizations there, Greece and Rome, and now we're going south a bit, looking at Africa. And the title of this section in particular is Diverse Societies in Africa, which is part of our overall chapter on African civilizations. And this unit is going to encompass some discussion of Africa, also a bit about Latin America. And so I'll go ahead and get into it. All right, so in the 19th century, the term the Dark Continent became popularized to refer to Africa. And occasionally you might still hear that term used to talk about Africa. It doesn't have to do with dark skin color. It rather was this idea meant to kind of conjure this sense that Africa was unknown, kind of mysterious. And this was a term that it was popularized in the 19th century by the explorer and reporter Henry Morton Stanley when he referred to Africa, and he published books titled Through the Dark Continent and In Darkest Africa. So, like I said, this was meant to represent how little was supposedly known about Africa. And it was true that most Europeans had little knowledge of Africa beyond its coast. But that said, this term was definitely an exaggeration on the part of Stanley, so he could boost sales of his book, creates this aura, this sense of mystery and intrigue surrounding Africa, right? Um, and wow, that mysterious dark continent. But truthfully, traders had traveled between Africa and other continents for centuries. There were sizable societies centuries before Stanley got to Africa. That said, it is also true that aspects of Africa have made it more difficult to understand and slower to develop than some other places. So we will look at that. All right, to start off, we're going to look a little bit at some of Africa's geography and some interesting features of it. So first up, Africa is the second largest continent. It occupies about 1/5 of the Earth's land surface. That's pretty significant, obviously. There aren't many harbors or ports or inlets in Africa. And what's interesting there is that because of that, the coastline is actually shorter than Europe's, which is 1/3 of Africa's size. Because Europe has all these ins and outs and coves and bays and all that sort of thing. The way you measure coastline is a little bit tricky, but however you tend to measure it, Europe's coastline is actually longer than Africa's. And on top of that, in terms of getting to know the inland part of Africa, the interior, the rivers are tough to navigate. We'd say that they are not very navigable because they have lots of waterfalls and rapids. And so it just does make it difficult to get around inside Africa. And something else we see here, maps always are going to distort around Earth in some fashion. You can't possibly represent an essentially spherical object on a flat surface, not 100% accurately. So different maps are always going to kind of emphasize different things. But one thing that we often tend to see with what they're called projections that we normally see is Africa is very often represented as being a little smaller relative to other continents than we would think, especially if you go back to using one of the early famous global maps, which is called the Mercator projection. But here, this map is intended to tweak things to where maybe the shapes are represented in ways that are a little bit skewed, not so accurate, but the sizes are more accurately reflected. And so here we get a sense for really how big Africa is, particularly in relation to something like Europe and or their Australia over on the side. Okay, some other things that have made Africa difficult to both sort of settle and also to get to know are these challenging environments that we find there. One of those being the Sahara. Now, the image we usually have of the Sahara is this image on the left, right? These sweeping sand dunes. It's kind of very exotic looking. maybe kind of scary because we imagine getting stuck there and there's no water or anything. Um, these intense sandstorms blowing in your face. But really, that's only a small piece of the overall Sahara. Most of the Sahara looks more like what we find over here on the right, with just scattered rocks and gravel. It's kind of gray wasteland. So pretty unappealing, and it's huge. About the size of, I want to say North America. It's very large. Maybe not quite that big, but it's a huge area. Okay, um, we're going to look at four different types of geography that we specifically find, or of environments that we find in Africa. And another is the Sahel. Sahel means coastline in Arabic, but it is not the coastline. Instead, the Sahel is the southern edge of the desert, of the Sahara specifically, where desert is taking over. So deserts, as the surrounding area loses vegetation, doesn't get enough rainfall, they also become part of the desert. So that area is considered its sort of own unique geographic region. Okay, so another environment that we find in Africa, one that you all will likely be familiar with, is a rainforest. And in rainforest, this might seem a little more appealing in terms of a place to live than the wasteland that we find of the Sahara, but there are still difficulties in terms of human settlement in this type of area. Uh, for example, the rainforest produces these mahogany and teak trees that are up to 150 feet tall, and their leaves and branches form this canopy that prevents sunlight from entering. So obviously people gravitate to having sunlight, and it's not so appealing to live in this area without it. It also traps heat in there and humidity. And on top of that, you have this particular uh, insect called the tsetse fly, whose bite produces a disease that can be fatal, and it's called the sleeping sickness. So, it can be fatal not only to humans but to livestock. So, if you're trying to have kind of a settled society in the rainforest, these are challenges that you have to confront. All right, so a final region that we have here, and I'm realizing the slide got cut off there at the bottom. That's a shame. But is the savanna. So the savanna is grassland, and this is the largest environment that we find in Africa. It covers about 40% of the continent. And so there we can see Timon and Pumbaa looking out over the savanna, right? So grassy plains that they can include these mountainous highlands and some tropical stretches in there, but those would sort of be peppered in into the overall grassy lands. So it's kind of, you may have these little pockets that are kind of set within. You could kind of think of like polka dotting this overall region, but still grasslands mostly. And yeah, the meme there unfortunately gets cut off, but says half of my heart is in Savannah, oh na na. So there you go. Obviously, one, it is yeah, that's not how the song goes, and two, it's talking about even a different Savannah. There's a Savannah, Georgia, that is in the United States with an H on the end. Savannah as a grassland, there's no H. Okay, so despite the challenges of living in Africa and creating societies there, nevertheless, there have been people living in Africa for millennia, right? Its earliest peoples were nomadic hunter-gatherers, and there are still people in Africa who live that way, particularly the San people in the Kalahari Desert, and the Batumbute, who are nomadic peoples living in the rainforests of the Congo. Um, Others did learn to domesticate animals early on, and so today there's a people group called the Maasai who actually measure their wealth by the size of their herds. And in fact, although there remain nomadic peoples today, the transition to a settled lifestyle, like we learned about in other places, the Neolithic Revolution, right? This began in Africa around 6000 BC. So this is a trend that happened in different places at maybe a little bit different times. In Africa, 6000 BC. So you could go grow grain in the savannas, the grasslands, raise cattle in areas where the tsetse fly wasn't. And the growing of one's food, as we saw in other places, allowed people to build permanent settlements. So you have this reliable food supply that leads to longer, healthier lives. And then it gives people the ability, the time, leisure time to practice other things, such as working metal, making pottery, and crafting jewelry. So in these early societies in Africa, generally you find people forming small groupings. You have families forming clans, but despite these groups remaining small, they did share some characteristics in common. For example, interestingly, they almost all believed in one creator, one God. But on top of that, they also believed in animism. So it's like there's one creator, but then you have this thing called animism, which is a system of thought that said, well, we believe spirits are just present in kind of everything, in animals, plants, other natural forces. And so you're sort of constantly encountering the supernatural because spirits inhabit everything. Another feature that you find commonly in these early societies are a type of person called a griot. It looks like griot or griot, but we would say griot. So griots were storytellers who shared the history and literature of a culture orally, and they would pass down this history. So this is one way that we have some knowledge about these early societies. Okay, so on top of it being a mistake to think that there were no societies of any kind in Africa before Europe showed up, Europeans came along, it would also be a mistake to think that there was no progression, no development going on. Because there was, and in fact, it went a little bit differently than what we found in some other places. So perhaps most significantly, you have the West African Iron Age. And what we find is, like it says there, the main source of information for archaeologists about early West African cultures has been from artifacts like pottery, charcoal, and slag. Slag being a waste product of iron smelting. So when you find that kind of stuff, you get an idea for how the society functioned, right? What the kind of things were that they did, their practices, what they were able to do. And we find this evidence of iron production going all the way back to 500 BC by a people called the Nok people of sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan means to the south of the Sahara. And what's kind of interesting is it actually seems like the sub-Saharan peoples skipped the copper and bronze ages and they just went right to iron. So some people, if you look in the Middle East, for example, it was sort of seen, oh, you had to go through this progression from a Stone Age to a Copper Age to Bronze Age and then to Iron. Well, they just sort of skipped those steps in Africa and just went right to an Iron Age. And then also, Nok artifacts have been found in an area stretching across 300 miles. So this shows that their influence wasn't just in this little pocket, right? It's actually a pretty sizable region where this people is exerting its influence. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Nok people when we get together again next in class. But to end this video, I want to highlight one other thing, which is this city known as Jene Jano. And what's important about Jene Jano is that although a lot of what we find in early African history is these kind of smaller villages, smaller societies, like it says here, unlike the small villages mostly found south of the Sahel, Jene Jano was a major city that arose along a tributary of the Niger River in West Africa. So we found all kinds of artifacts there, like pottery, copper hair ornaments, clay toys, glass beads, and iron knives. And the oldest objects date all the way back to 250 BC, and the city was abandoned sometime after 1400 AD. So this means it obviously endured for a long, long time, right? And they had learned to smelt iron by the 3rd century BC. So it's a pretty thriving place, and its height having about 50,000 residents. So a pretty thriving metropolis, right? Obviously, it's not the scale of city sizes we find in some other places. Rome, which we just looked at, had 1 million people at its peak, or even in at the time when Jesus was born. But Jene Jano did become a major trading center, They exchanged their rice, fish, and pottery for copper, gold, and salt. So didn't just sit there and operate for itself. It was actually a trading depot, and that's where I got to end.